Hello, I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. Welcome to another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today, a show about emerging technology and trends in mobility with leaders and innovators to make it all happen. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to be joined by Kevin Boehm, professional race car driver and motorsports engineer, Boehm Motorsports. On today's episode, we discussed preparing for race day and the role that engineers play in search of the perfect mile. We hope you enjoy this episode. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. I'll say it point blank. Racing's cool. You get to drive cars really fast and not get speeding tickets. This is great.
You're not wrong there. That's for sure.
What first got you into racing? Was there a pivotal moment in your life? Or maybe you got a speeding ticket, so I don't want that anymore. I'll do it on the track.
Well, I mean, I was very fortunate. My dad was kind of a gearhead growing up, and he never had the means to do a lot with it, but he was always hands-on and made the most of what he could with what he had. And I think really that kind of seeing him around, it was drag racing at the time, seeing him work on everything, like he did all the work himself, he figured all the problems out himself, like that taught me, that set me down a path, seeing that as an example. And I think it was once I learned that there was a career that could put you into a motorsports industry, such as engineering, it really just opened up my eyes into maybe I could live inside of motorsports, and the rest is really history from there.
You credit your father and the exposure to drag racing to where you are today?
I think that was the foundation. I mean, I liked the sound of loud cars. I liked I was always competitive growing up, playing different sports and things, so I really liked the challenge of kind of just competition in general. So motorsports really scratched that itch, and I think really it was through sim racing, and believe it or not, very, very early when I was a kid, I didn't get to drive go-karts or anything like that, so I got to drive on a computer, and it was the kind of pursuit for like a perfect lap that really got me. It just focused me into a mindset that I couldn't get anywhere else. He started it, and then it was once I discovered what the mindset that I could achieve when driving, that was something I just had to find a way to get more of.
Did you build your own rig? Yeah, you had the gearhead background. Did you build your own sim rig?
I mean, in the very beginning, it was just a steering wheel strapped to a desk. It wasn't anything very fancy. In fact, I mean, back then, I don't think any kind of sim rig really existed. They hadn't been invented yet. But once I'd done that for quite a while, and this is actually after I started driving cars, I did end up kind of building my own rig out of plywood. It wasn't very beautiful, but it was perfectly functional. And a lot of people described it as it looked like a plywood lawnmower, and they're not wrong. But in the end, it held the steering wheel in the right place. The ergonomics were good. So I learned a lot from that thing.
Do you feel that starting with sim gave you a competitive advantage as you moved into true motorsports and getting on the track?
I think it accelerated things. I think being able to drive a sim essentially gave me a process for how I was going to learn a track, a process for how I would learn a car, and even gave me clues on whether I was doing something right or wrong. So it really just gave me a bit of a head start. But even today, I mean, simulation has progressed quite a lot in the last 10, 15 years. And even today, they're not perfect. You can't ultimately rely on it for what a car really feels like, but you can learn a lot from it. So I still use the sim today to prep for different events, and it's used as a tool. And as with kind of any of your tools, the tools have a purpose, and you have to understand kind of the limits of what it can be used for, and then you fill in the gaps other ways if you need to.
Nuremberg's one of your favorite tracks. So is that what's on the sim? Is that what's on your sim all the time?
I don't drive that on the sim quite as often as I like. I think typically I'm trying to drive tracks that are up on the schedule next most often. I do go back and drive the Nürburgring on the sim every now and then just for the fun of it. It doesn't do the real track justice though, because the fear that happens in real life, you can hit the reset button quite easily. So I think I definitely enjoy that track on the sim more than most, just to drive as a way to relax, because it really does take a ton of your attention to get right, for sure.
Where does the fear come in from driving? Is it a blind corner? Is it hitting the right line on a corner? Is it the acceleration off the line? Where does that fear come from?
Well, I mean, fear is kind of relative. It's not like I'm shaking in my boots or anything, but it's more about the kind of understanding the consequences. So, I mean, one of the natures of driving fast on a track is that you're trying to get as close as possible to the physical limits of what the car and the car's connection to the road will allow. And the only real way to know that you're at that limit is to go beyond it every now and then. And I think at a track like the Nürburgring, where the distance from the edge of the track to a fairly solid object is very small, you don't have a lot of margin for error. So whenever you're trying to approach that limit, you have to do it much more precisely, because the consequences are much more kind of high. And then on top of that, that particular track, the speeds, or the average speed over a lap, is very, very high. So it's much easier to make a little bit of a mistake at low speed, because the lower the speed, the smaller the consequences. But when the speed starts to get really high, you can really run out of room, run out of road, and you don't have a lot of time to make up for something if something happens unexpectedly.
What's going through your head when you're behind the wheel going into a turn? Is it all you're running engineering calculations? What's going through your head as you're approaching a turn?
When everything's going perfectly, there's very little happening. It's more focused about the. I have an intended input to the vehicle, so I know where roughly I'm going to hit the brakes. So I'm making sure that I do that very precisely. I know roughly where I'm going to be turning in to begin the corner, so I'm paying a lot of attention to my current speed and location to be able to do that very precisely. I know where I want to be at the middle of the turn. I know which direction I want the car to be pointed. So it's basically, when everything's perfect, you're really just comparing your intention to what you're actually doing, and you're trying to make small little corrections to kind of fix any kind of small error. And there is no perfect lap. I think that's the beautiful thing about the pursuit of doing a perfect lap, is even when you feel like you've driven the most perfect one you ever have, you almost discover the next thing that could make it even better. And that just keeps happening over and over and over again, where the kind of, I wouldn't say engineering calculation, but the engineering mindset really comes into play when things start to go wrong. Maybe you start to hear a sound that is not normal, or maybe you feel something that's not normal, and being able to interpret that, and based on the clues that you're given, be able to quickly diagnose that and communicate that back to your team, so that you can kind of get back into a normal situation much quicker. That's where that really comes into play.
Before you make that turn, how did you prepare for that before you step foot in the vehicle on the track that day?
I think it really depends on if I've been there before, if I've driven the car before, but everything is known. If it's a track that I've driven hundreds and hundreds of laps at, or if it's a car that I've got tons of time in, then I don't really have to think a lot of actively about it. It's once I get in the car, I already know roughly what I want to do. I know where the car there's a lot of pre-understanding of what the car should be able to do. And you essentially make a bit of a prediction. You hit the brakes and you turn in exactly where you think you should. And then it's a constant iteration of, maybe that you hit the brakes a little bit early. Next time you're going to correct that by moving their braking point a little bit. Maybe you turned in a little early or late, so the next lap you kind of save that information, and you do that every single corner. But every kind of input that you're doing to the car, you can almost save whether that was good, bad, what you might want to do next time. And then when you come back around to that same point, you recall that information right before you do your inputs again. And you just a constant comparison of what you wanted to do with the car, what you actually did, how the car reacted to it, what you might want to do different next time. And then you do that every single corner, every single lap.
Is that in the pursuit of the perfect lap, where you're just constantly trying to modify in pursuit of that perfect lap?
That's right. I mean, and like I said earlier, like it's when you feel like, okay, the car did exactly what I expected it to. I put the car exactly where I wanted it to. But then you're thinking, well, it felt like maybe the car had a little bit more grip than I expected. So now I'm going to try to adjust my speed next time. And maybe you do that, but maybe you adjust your speed a little too much. So then you're always iterating. You're always trying, well, what if I did this? What if we tried this? Maybe if I positioned the car better, differently, maybe I pointed the car a different direction, and all those things need to balance together. So trying to find the perfect combination of your speed, your position, your direction that you're traveling, all those things you have to try to adjust. And sometimes we're not talking about going 5 miles an hour faster. Maybe we're talking about a quarter mile an hour faster. Maybe we're talking about moving the car 1 foot to the right or using the curb 3 inches more. Sometimes it becomes really, really small, but that's where you're really starting to hone in on that kind of limit.
It's all that, obviously you have a mental database in your head, but is that data then put into a database where the team is able to work with you as you go throughout the racing season to help perfect your driving?
Yeah, I mean and this was all the way from the beginning, even before I was racing, when I was just driving on tracks, doing track days and things. I've always recorded data from those sessions, and in the beginning that was limited to just data created by GPS. So that might be speed, kind of calculated lateral and longitudinal acceleration, very, very minimal information, but a great way to compare, well, why was this lap faster than that lap? And you can actually look back and understand, well, maybe this was better and here's why. Today, it's grown quite a bit. The cars that I race today generate a lot of data. It's an unbelievable amount of data that records every single thing that I'm doing to the car, from the steering position, the throttle position, the brake pressures, the brake pressure from the pedal, the brake pressure at each individual wheel. You have all the outputs from the car. So you have the speed, the wheel speeds, you have the yaw rate, the accelerations of the vehicle. You have a bunch of diagnostic information generated by the engines. We have the tire pressures, the tire temperatures. We have brake temperatures. We have tons of information that you can analyze myself as the driver, but also analyze the car, because in reality, the driver is just a kind of a piece of the car. So you need to analyze all those things together. And sometimes what we're trying to do is I'm trying to make sure I'm making the car go as fast as the car can go. But then at the same time, we need to also be looking into making sure that we're making the car as fast as it can go. So sometimes we're adjusting the car with that data. Sometimes we're adjusting me as the driver. Sometimes we're trying to find a better combination of what the car's kind of limitation is versus the driver limitation. So the data is a great way essentially to check some of the things that I feel behind the wheel too. So sometimes I may think that the car is doing something, but maybe it's a little bit more complex and there's several things happening at once, and I'm only picking up on one or two of those things. So the data is a great way to compare to what I'm feeling behind the wheel and to make sure that we're going down the right road and we're making the right adjustments to essentially make that performance window of the car bigger.
Is that data coming off the vehicle in real time?
So some cars are it's possible to do that. The racing series that I'm in now, the rules actually prohibit that, and to some extent it's a bit of a cost kind of constraint, but most of the data is generated, it's saved within the car, and we can download that data at the end of every session to basically prepare for the next. What's interesting as well is, in order to make the racing really, really competitive, because we're racing different manufacturers. We have BMWs, we have Mercedes, Porsches, Aston Martins, just tons of different manufacturers. And some of the cars are front engine, mid engine. There's lots of different configurations. So how do you make all those cars go the same speed so the racing is close? Well, the kind of organizing body, the racing series, also takes that data, and they are comparing all the different manufacturers and trying to make sure that the cars accelerate at the same rate. They have similar braking characteristics and cornering characteristics and so on and so forth. So the data is not just used within our team, but it's used within the series to make sure the competition is as close as possible as well.
That makes for a great fan experience where it's not one person running away with it. It makes for a really great level playing field, to use that term. How long does it typically prepare to prepare for a race? You have the data. I'm assuming you're an engineer, so you're going in data wonk world and going through all the nitty gritty of that. But I'm sure there's training and perhaps simulation. How long does it take to prepare for a race?
I mean, I think in a perfect world, you need at least a week, but in reality, you use as much time as you have. I think as soon as we finish with a racing event, there's about a week worth of summary for that event, and then we move right on to the next event to start prepare for it. We try to take any lessons learned at the most recent event, and we apply that to what the kind of information we already have. We start to compare that to the kind of uniqueness of whatever the next event is, and we just begin from there. And we do it that way because you want to constantly build on anything new that you've learned. Sometimes you may learn something at a track and it may not apply anywhere else. Maybe it was something that's just a very specific local characteristic, but often you learn something through the data, through making a change in the car, through doing different things that it may apply in more places. So we always have to kind of dig into that and make sure that there's not something that we need to know. And then essentially, I mean, every track is a little bit different, from the surface, from how bumpy it is, from how aggressive the curbs are. There's so many different things you have to consider, and essentially you have to start preparing for those things that are unique to each individual event as soon as possible, because it takes time to adjust the car. We're not really allowed a lot of significant changes. The limitations for what we're allowed to adjust are pretty tight, but some of them take longer than others. So we need to, if we're going to make one of the bigger changes, we need to make it sooner than later so that we physically have enough time to do it. That's one of the big differences from sim racing, because you can go through a bunch of changes and it's as fast as you can move your mouse. So the real world operates at a different speed. So that's definitely one of the challenges in prepping for the next event.
The real world has altitude changes, climate, weather changes. Certain tracks are at higher altitudes than other tracks. Some are closer to the water, some are higher in the mountains. Certain ones are in warmer weather versus colder weather. What role does that play if you're in a track in Northern California versus a track in South Florida? The climate's a lot different. You have humidity, you have no humidity, you have a bumpy road, smooth. How do you prepare for all those, let's call it unique elements of racing?
Well, I mean, macroscopically, everyone has to deal with all of those variables. Like all your competition are, because you're racing in the same location, the same day, whatever the big changes are, they're also dealing with. So the thing that you have to really focus on is how can you account for those better than they can? And some things are just the result of whatever it is. So for example, your kind of air pressure and air, like the ambient temperature and things like that, you can't control those. And the engine or the kind of the power of the car is just going to automatically kind of adjust to whatever it can do based on those conditions. But at the same time, the differences in temperatures affect things like your tire quite a bit. And the tire is such an important component of a race car because it is the single connection between the car as a system to the road, and without that connection, you're not able to change your direction or speed or anything like that. So the temperature effects to the tire are something that we're constantly adjusting to, not just from one event to another, but even one session to another, and sometimes even in the middle of a race. So we may be changing tire pressure or the prep of the tire in the middle of a race if we can, because the weather conditions aren't constant even during our races. So you have to be able to predict that. You try to model it. You try to understand what the likelihood of different situations are. Cloud cover is very dynamic, so that changes the track temperature, for example. So those things are the most dynamic things, are the things that we have to focus on the most. But some of the air pressure and things like that, it's a little bit less because everybody's dealing with the same thing and it's a little bit more consistent. So it's really the temperature is the main thing that we're looking at, trying to stay on top of.
How about exercise? And I asked that, if you look at Sebring, it's a bumpy track. So maybe do you do more arm exercises versus leg exercise as you prepare physically? Because racing, you're a driver, you know this, it's taxing. It's not a joyride in a beautiful Rolls-Royce Phantom. It's taxing on your body. How do you physically prepare for races and different tracks with different environments?
Well, I think we're really fortunate because the cars that most of the modern race cars, they all have power steering, so it doesn't take a ton of energy in your arms to turn the steering wheel or things like that. But the brake systems are probably something that's fairly unique because we're able to adjust the brake distribution of pressure front to rear, and some of the things that the way the systems are designed to do that, it doesn't allow for power assisted brakes. So the brake pedal is quite heavy. And modern race cars have gotten quite heavy themselves. So that means there's a lot of pedal effort to stop these cars. And especially once you understand the performance windows, we're able to stop at 1.6, 1.7 Gs on a flat track. So before you even consider any kind of compression in the road or banking or anything like that. So whenever you have to push the brake pedal hard enough to generate that much G, it is very, very tiring. And we're doing that with one leg. So the funny thing is, so the calculation is it takes about 500 pounds of pressure of pedal force to stop the car at 1.7 G. So I'm doing about a 1.5 inch, 500-pound deadlift with one leg every single time I stop the car. So that's an example of something that you do have to train for before the events, because if you don't pay attention to that, then you'll find yourself at the end of a session, you'll be at 1.3 G or 1.2 G because you're just physically not pushing the brake pedal hard enough anymore. The other thing that you really have to pay attention to, especially as we go to a track like Sebring's in Florida, it's beginning to be summertime, and that means it's hot. And race cars get hot naturally, and the cars that we're in have windows that are fixed up. So you're in a greenhouse, the sun's going to be shining. So it gets to 130, 140 degrees inside the car. So the other thing that we have to train a lot for is just being physically ready for the temperature stress that you're going to be under in the car. So that's where things like hydration and nutrition really come into play. You can't just go into an event eating McDonald's and just not giving a care of what you're kind of putting into your body. You really have to treat it as knowing that it's going to be a big challenge, and even understanding how much fluid did I lose when I was in the car, and because you need to know how much you lost so that you know how much you need to put back in so that you don't essentially lose fluid through a whole weekend. You have to try to maintain. You can lose and gain, and you have to do that through the whole weekend. So it's a lot less about arms. It's more about legs today. And the seats are really good. So it's not like I'm holding myself into the car. I joke, but I'm also serious that I'm the most comfortable I've ever been in a race car because the seat just has you wrapped in. You can't move. Typically you're warm. So I think some of the best naps I've ever had are waiting for a race to start, which is good and bad. But at any rate, that's kind of what you have to do to prepare physically for one of these races.
It's taxing on the body. The legs are really interesting. Outside the body, mental. How do you maintain your mental awareness as you're going through? You're in 130, 140 degree hot box. You're sweating. You're losing water. Your legs are getting tired. Your arms are getting tired. How do you not allow mental fatigue to kick in?
Well, I think as long as I'm physically prepared enough to not feel fatigued when I'm behind the wheel, then it never really comes into my mind. I'm so busy going through the process of driving. So what we talked about earlier, where I'm just going through each step of every corner through every lap. I'm so busy thinking about that. I'm so busy thinking about the cars that are surrounding me and thinking about how I'm going to try to pass them or how I'm going to try to prevent them from passing me. There's a lot going on to keep you focused on those things. So that's where it's really important to make sure that you stay hydrated, that you have done all of your kind of physical preparation before you drive so that you don't become distracted by feeling fatigued or feeling thirsty or so on and so forth.
What role did Formula SAE play in your development as a race car driver and an engineer? I'm asking because you've got all the pieces together, and it's really impressive.
For me, I never focused so much on the driving when I was involved with Formula SAE. I mean, I enjoyed when we took the car out and did some testing in a parking lot and things like that, but I never really saw myself as I was just beginning kind of my driving at the time. So that car's performance kind of capabilities were outside of what my driving capabilities were at the time. So I really focused more on, I was always fascinated, especially when I was in university, with how you can make a car go faster. What little things were important. And I think for me in Formula SAE, it really gave me a chance to learn some of those things hands on. So it wasn't so much just reading an article online or trying to read in a book and reading a theory. We could physically go and change something. And I could, when I got the drive, I could see what it felt like. And it was making that connection that really reinforced a lot of my education. And then once I finally got to go out into the real world and do that on a regular basis, that it really just set me down a path of always trying to experience what the theory was so that I could just understand it a little bit more deeply.
Do you feel your background as an engineer gives you a competitive advantage on race day?
Probably on race day, maybe not. I think it's the days leading up to race day that I get, I would say it's more of an advantage. And what I mean by that is the things that go into prepping for an event, the things that go into once we're at the track and we're trying to figure out what's the thing holding us back from going even faster, and trying to identify those, and we're always trying to make the performance window of the car bigger. I think that's where kind of I have a little bit of an advantage. Of course, I think you can arrive at the same solution if you just get enough experience, but I'm able to accelerate some of that kind of performance increase, like the rate that we're able to do it, because I can generally recommend, well, I think it's this instead of that. And basically we can discuss why and so on and so forth. But I think it really comes into the prep for race day more so than race day. Once race day comes, we're not really making adjustments on the car anymore. It's just me in the car, and I've got to be the driver, and whatever the car is, it is. And to some small extent, maybe based on what the car's doing, it may give me clues on how I might need to adjust my driving to kind of make up for some limitation in the car. But that's more, I would say, less engineering, and it's more just experience in driving than it is anything else at that point.
Is the prep work the most important part of race week?
I would say so. And the reason why is if you can start out an event with a great car, well, you still have the same amount of time as everybody else does to make it even better. So if you're already on the front foot when you arrive and you just keep trying to make it better the whole time, well, everybody else just may not even make any progress. You just keep getting better and better. They might as well, but you just keep your kind of performance gap there. It's not like when we show up to an event, if we've done our prep work and the car feels great right out of the box. Those are some of the best events, but it's not like we sit back and relax for the rest of the race weekend and wait for the races to come. We actively try to find, well, what is actually holding us back from going even faster? Let's think even harder about what is limiting us from, is it the front of the car? Is it the back of the car? Is it the braking? Is it what could make us go even faster? And we just constantly are searching for what thing we could do even better. And all the competition is doing that as well, which is why it's so important. If you show up and you're just happy with what it feels like, well, you're just going to get outdeveloped through a race weekend.
What advice would you have for a young listener who's interested in both engineering and racing? Perhaps they're sitting here and like, tonight, you know what? I'm going to play Gran Turismo tonight. I'm inspired. What advice would you have for them?
It's tough. I mean, I talk to a lot of people at the racetrack about this, and I think for me, using education to give me a leg up in motorsports has worked out really, really well. And there's no guarantee that will work for everybody, but I definitely encourage everybody to try to use education as a tool to basically become the better version of themselves. And whether you end up behind the wheel of the car or you end up behind the laptop during race weekends, kind of calling strategy or making the engineering calls, I think either way, you're going to have a ton of fun in this industry. It's going to be a huge challenge. I mean, even the kind of getting the degree is a challenge. And I think that's part of what makes it so rewarding once you kind of are doing something with it. And then it never gets any easier because motorsports is a competition. So you only really feel satisfied when you walk away the winner, and the odds are never in your favor to do that. So it's a constant challenge. So you have to go into that knowing it firsthand. But it really starts with the education and getting the most out of that when you can, because you're surrounded with so many smart people. And then the rest is really up to your dedication and kind of ambition to see how far you can take it from there.
You can go as far as you want. You just got to go in pursuit of the perfect lap, and you got to keep trying, and try again. In your opinion, Kevin, what does the future of racing look like?
Well, I mean, we're in an interesting time in the automotive world right now, because we're clearly, there's a lot of focus on kind of electric vehicles, and there's a lot of challenges that come when you think about, well, will we see electric racing? And we see a little bit of that now with things like Formula E. People are doing track days with their Teslas and things like that. I can see some more electric only kind of racing series come up. But there's a lot of challenges with that, with how to kind of keep it safe. Those cars are a lot heavier. So from a track safety standpoint, there needs to be a lot of thought into the safety systems that are in place. Fire is another big challenge with electric cars because of the batteries and things like that. And even training the safety crews at different tracks to be ready for the different types of fires that happen with electric cars. But I still see a lot of kind of internal combustion engine racing for quite a while. And I think we'll see it a lot more with kind of hybrid approaches. So we see that a lot in prototype racing today, and things like Formula One, for example, and IndyCar here soon. So we're going to see a lot of hybrid approaches. And I really like to see that, because that's a great place to utilize racing to help develop and identify some of the challenges to make those systems even more efficient for all the way down to the consumer. So I think we're going to see a lot of what we see today, just a bit of a shift towards hybrid and some newer EV racing in the future, I believe.
It's going to be interesting as it shifts to hybrids. And you're right, with the battery electric, there's the speed issue as well, because their acceleration, there's the track issues. As we've seen in multiple fire reports, the foam doesn't put the fire out, so the tracks are going to have to figure out, perhaps it's a chemical breakthrough or some sort of engineering breakthrough that can put the fires out. It's going to be interesting. We all know the cars are going to go fast. That's the common denominator, and everybody's going to go in search of that perfect lap. Kevin, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, which for record has been awesomely cool, and love to go racing with you one day, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
Well, I think it builds on what I was saying earlier, which is really use your engineering education, or use your kind of technical background to really push the bounds of what you can do with it. I think we're as engineers, we're in a really unique situation where often we can be presented with problems that no one have had to solve before. So being able to use our background to develop new things, solve new problems, come up with brand new solutions, whether it's with racing or not, that's the thing that we kind of have. And I just encourage everyone to kind of use their engineering background to just do something cool. And for me, that's racing. It doesn't have to be racing for everybody, but I think there's something like racing for me out there for everybody.
Engineering can push the bounds of what's possible. Engineering's cool. Today is tomorrow. Tomorrow is today. The future is Bowman Motorsports. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on SAE Tomorrow Today.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to SAE Tomorrow Today. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, please kindly rate, review, and let us know what topics you'd like for us to explore next. Be sure to join us next week as we discuss the consumer's perception of electric vehicles with the head of insights at Edmunds.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.